Let's go to Indiana, Maryland, and I think Indiana played maybe the worst game they could have played. I thought Rourke, I called it. Rourke, 2 picks, and they were both in the first quarter. It was like he heard my podcast, and he's like, "Zach, I'm gonna throw these in terrible spots for you just to prove your listeners right, or prove to your listeners you're right." But I thought there were times where their run defense was not sound, was not gap sound. I thought there were times that Rourke really forced things, and yet they still won by 14. They won by 14 despite the fact that Maryland had 0 turnovers and Indiana had 4. And let's be clear, it was 42-21, and then Maryland scored with, 2 minutes left in the ball game, 3 minutes left in the ball game. Indiana outgained Maryland by over 100 yards. Curtis Rourke was, he, aside from the picks, man, 22 of 33, 359 yards, 3 touchdowns. He's averaging over 10 yards a clip. That's like close to, actually, it's close to 11 yards per attempt. The running game was good. Not great, but I think that's something that I wanted to see is, can this team run the ball? And they did. Like Lawton, 19 carries, 93 yards and a touchdown. The receivers, Elijah Surratt, man, that dude is, he is physical. He's got an attitude. Just really, really good. And despite the fact that they allowed 400 yards, just remember they're playing against one of the better receiving cores in the country in Felton, in Prather. Prather had a good day. But they held Felton in check. Ty Felton, 5 catches, only 38 yards. So, they took him out of the game for the most part. They allowed Roman Hendy to run. But outside of a 75-yard run, here's I think the key stat. Outside of a 75-yard run, they had only, let me do math here, 37 yards. So 29 carries, 37 yards, and then a 75-yard touchdown run by Hemby. So that was a mistake, right? That was a mistake. But other than that, I thought Indiana acquitted themselves quite well against what can be a good offense. And they committed 4 turnovers and still essentially blew Maryland out. Now, granted, it was close until the fourth quarter, but it wasn't close in the fourth quarter. And I think the reality is Indiana was a much better team than Maryland. I think we're seeing that Indiana is no joke. Indiana's 5-0. I just want to do an exercise with you. This is their schedule. They play at Northwestern. That'll be, at Northwestern might be a little tough, but I think they win that game. They host Nebraska. They host Washington. I think both those games are toss-ups. At Michigan State's a toss-up. Then they host Michigan. I think that's a toss-up. Then they get a bye. And then they go on the road to Ohio State. And they play Purdue at home. Are we looking down the barrel of Indiana being a 10-win team this year? Because I'll be honest, if you put a gun to my head and you said, who's winning Nebraska, who's winning Indiana or Northwestern? I'm saying Indiana for that one easily. Indiana versus Nebraska, I might pick Indiana. Indiana versus Washington, I might pick Indiana. Indiana at Michigan State, probably picking Indiana. Michigan, Indiana, I don't know. I might pick Indiana for that one, depending on how they look. Against Purdue, I'm picking Indiana. Now, I don't know if they have the depth to avoid the letdown or to, if they get injuries. But listen, are we looking at a possible playoff team in the Hoosiers? With this schedule and with some of the other teams losing in the national scope, I don't know, man. It's they're playing really well, and I especially offensively. Now, and I know Maryland's defense isn't great. They were, turnover happy, and they got a bunch of turnovers. But man, I mean, they have just put it on teams. I'm excited to see them play against Northwestern, who I think does have a good defense. But man, this is an explosive team with good receivers, good running backs, and I think a quarterback who, despite his mistakes, again continues to show that he is one of the best quarterbacks in this league. I think Maryland. If I'm Maryland, I'm obviously concerned because typically in any given year, you look at Indiana as a win. You got to beat Northwestern next week, or not in 2 weeks. They got to bye, and then if you want to hit a bowl game, you've got to get Minnesota, and you got to hope that you can beat one of USC, Oregon, Rutgers, Iowa, and Penn State, and get an upset there. Because otherwise, you're talking about maybe you're talking about 5-7, 4-8, and that really dashes the hopes of the type of program that Mike Locksley was trying to build. So they have a rough road ahead, right? It was always going to be backloaded, but I think when we first looked at the season, I think we expected them to beat Michigan State and we expected them to beat Indiana, and they did not. So this is going to be a tough road. I think Northwestern, they better hope they win. At Minnesota, they better hope they win because USC, Oregon, Rutgers, Iowa, Penn State, I don't know if I see a win there. Maybe against Rutgers. I think they can get Rutgers because of the style of play. But even that, with the strength of Rutgers' team, I think being their back seven and their secondary, I don't know. It's a tough road, and I don't think the issue is the quarterback. I think Billy Edwards has been playing lights out, but I think the defense has been kind of feast or famine. I think the run game has stunk. I think their offensive line has not been great. So, tough road ahead.